When looking through the data files of Genshin Impact, every character is given an asset ID number, which is then referenced via the character index. Apart from being the first one being Kate Castellana, likely in reference to Honkai Impact 3rd, who was purely meant for development testing only, the second index below was Kamisato Ayaka, signifying that she was the first Genshin Impact character created by Hoyo even before the varied traveler themselves. The Shirasagi Himegimi is one of Genshin's most beloved characters in history, as despite being released in version 2, players are well aware of her existence from the start of the game, due to her being accessible during the beta test. As a result, ample time was allowed for generating hype and interest towards her eventual release, and what a release it was. Ayaka took over the meta by storm, becoming one of the game's premier damage dealers and establishing herself as the frontrunner of Cryo for quite some time. All things considered, her maiden voyage was nothing short of exceptional, with many longtime players, myself included, having fond memories of her back in 2021 and 2022. And while it feels like it hasn't been that long, almost 3 years have passed since Ayaka's release. What changed? Where does she stand now? In today's episode of What Happened To, we'll be featuring the matriarch of the Kamisato clan. While we're on the subject of talking about Genshin's Japanese region, let's talk actual Japan for a moment. This video is brought to you by Zen Market. Zen Market's a platform that allows you to purchase goods and products from over 10,000 Japanese stores. Essentially what they do is buy the item for you in Japan and then ship it to you, kind of like how Uber Eats can deliver food from restaurants who don't have their own delivery service. Fashion, anime, manga, games and toys, music, hobby stuff, electronics, stationery, all kinds of products from well-known stores like Anime, Big Camera, Surugaya, and so on. All you have to do is copy the item link and then paste it into the Zen Market shop. Having just gone to Japan a couple weeks ago, there were a ton of things I wanted to buy, but like most other travelers, I didn't have enough space in my luggages to bring everything back home. Zen Market's a safe and cheap way you can still get your hands on Japan-only products from home, provided they're eligible for international shipping. They can hold your stuff for up to 60 days for free and have support for 19 languages. It's a well-trusted platform used by over 2 million users across the world, with multiple shipping and payment methods to work with. If you sign up using my code Vars, you can get 750 Zen points gift to start with, which converts to 750 yen off shipping specifically. So if you're someone who wants to buy Japanese goods but can't go to Japan, this is the next best way to do it. Thanks to Zen Market for sponsoring the video, but for now, back to what happened to Ayaka. Genshin's characters all have their respective fan bases, loyal and dedicated to their favorite units almost as if they were real. Over the years, we've had a long list of candidates with ardent followers. Whether you hear their praises sung in the comments on YouTube or Reddit, or fan arts and cosplays made of them, finding that level of support is hard to come by, especially in a gacha game. Shogun, Ganyu, Nahida, Eula, Yelan, Chongli, and Alhaitham, to name a few, are among the most adored characters in the Genshin community, but few, if any, had a comparable legacy to Ayaka, who, like I said, was one of the most beloved characters in all of Genshin Impact during her time, and this is without having the privileges of being an Archon or anything like that. Gameplay aside, I believe she was the first and only unit to receive a dedicated trailer/promotional video for her rerun banner, underscoring how popular she was not just amongst the player base but perhaps Hoyo themselves. Even the Archons didn't get this kind of attention. It was truly unprecedented. From being the first character ever conceptualized according to game files and having special promotional material made for her second banner, it would be no exaggeration to say that she was Genshin's favorite child back then. This was further compounded by the somewhat mimetic reputation her rerun banner had, where due to political and logistical issues that took place in 2022, Ayaka's banner would be extended to account for the delay for the next version. Because it wasn't exactly clear how long that delay would be, at one point Ayaka's banner was slated to last 240 days, giving her the title of the longest running banner to this day, and a bunch of yandere memes were made about you being stuck with her forever. Ayaka's popularity was reinforced even further through her gameplay strength, as she was far and away one of the most powerful damage dealers during the better part of version 2. In spite of there already being a highly priced Cryo 5-star in the form of Ganyu, Ayaka stood out by concentrating a lot more of her power budget on raw damage output, front-loaded damage to be exact, without necessarily sacrificing on uptime and ease of use. Her 1000 cuts nature practically disqualified her from reverse melt teams, as her rate of attack was simply too high for any pyro unit to keep up with, placing her firmly in the freeze category. Alongside Radin National and Vaporize, Freeze was one of the dominant teams for most of Genshin's early game, with sufficient Cryo and Hydro application. Assuming the target wasn't immune to the status effect, you could perpetually stop enemies from moving or attacking, making Freeze theoretically the most powerful and consistent reaction in the game, as you could totally forego the need for defensive utility on account of you never getting attacked. Even nowadays, Freeze is widely touted for how much it trivializes the difficulty of the game, prompting Hoyo to release more and more enemies of Freeze immunity for that very reason. The trade-off was that Freeze offered no direct boost to one's DPS like other reactions, a deficiency that's become more pronounced over the years, which I'll get into in a moment. However, Ayaka overcame that through sheer internal strength. Her base damage and uptime allowed her to take advantage of Freeze keeping enemies immobilized to dish out incredible DPS. Thanks to her alternate sprint, she essentially has permanent cryo infusion on her basic attacks whose damage is further augmented for a short duration after casting her skill courtesy of her A1. But the real icing on the cake, no pun intended, was her trademark Blizzard, Solmetsu, a gale force tornado that slowly advanced from the point of cast to deal rapid cryo damage to all enemies caught within. If every strike connected, she could potentially one-shot even boss enemies with this attack, and if you acquired C2, with the aid of some form of crowd control, Ayaka could also decimate groups of enemies at record time, making her both a very efficient boss killer and wave clearer. For the better part of version 2, Ayaka stood shoulder to shoulder with the best teams at that time, including but not limited to Raiden National, Child International, Sucrose Taser, Mono Geo to a lesser extent, and then later Double Hydro following the advent of Yelan. While Ganyu was more suited for general usage, Ayaka was a clear favorite in the realm of pure damage, and remember, she received no extra DPS from the freeze reaction, unless of course you count not having to chase after enemies. It was all her own power, putting into perspective just how strong she was. She received more support in this department following Shinho's release, a 5-star support character with a niche focus on buffing cryo damage across the board, from normal and charge attacks to elemental skills and bursts, all aspects for which Ayaka was qualified in, as everything in her kit was about dealing damage. She took great advantage of this opportunity, and the two units have been practically joined at the hip since then, much like how you would see Vars unattached to Shao and Wanderer and Goro getting in bed with Ito. Version 2 saw major upgrades for other teams as well. National Team got Shogun, Huta received Yelan, Taser got Yaimiko, and so on. But thanks to receiving Shunho, Ayaka lost no market share during the latter half of version 2. If anything, she became even more popular for being a no-brainer solution to any chamber with enemies that could be frozen, or even freeze-immune enemies that stood still for the entire fight, highlighting just how much damage you can dish out with her, especially with the right supports. Accentuating her usability was how far you could take her. Having fairly decent area coverage, Ayaka synergized extremely well with Venti and Kazuha, capitalizing on their VV Shred boosting cryo damage and their crowd control and grouping improving the coverage of her ultimate. Incorporating both basic attacks and abilities into her repertoire, she could use Xingqiu and Yelan to drive her freeze teams, or use Kokomi and be successful all the same. Thanks to the unique interaction Freeze had in preserving Mona's illusory bubble, Ayaka had a long-lasting 60% damage amp to work with as well, giving her tons of high-quality supports to draw from despite technically only having one playstyle. Additionally, with Freeze itself being both an offensive and defensive reaction, teams involving her with Zelda bring sustain at all and instead go full damage, such as Ayaka, Shunho, Mona, and Kazuha for 4 offensive units, compared to other teams having only 3, a huge advantage to have as there weren't many sustain supports that didn't require you to sacrifice DPS in some capacity. Moreover, Cryo's main artifact set, the Blizzard Strayer, was practically made for her. When paired in tandem with Cryo Resonance, Ayaka gained 55% bonus crit for free as her Blizzard can maintain freeze on enemies for the entire duration, letting her focus all of her attention on going crit damage instead of crit rate since you only needed 45% to cap her out. While most of the units would have to settle for 150 to 200% crit damage at most, Ayaka could easily exceed 250% by virtue of not having to go after bold stats. So while it took a fair bit of investment to get her to that endgame hypercarry status, the fact that she had a fairly high ceiling meant you could be handsomely rewarded for the effort you put into her, establishing her as one of the best units in the game courtesy of her affinity for vertical investment. The sheer power contained within her was what enabled her to survive version 3 more comfortably than her counterpart Ganyu. Though Cryo had no direct synergy with Dendro teams, the fact remains in any chamber with enemies that could be frozen, Ayaka was an extremely strong option to go for. In addition, Cryo's unintrusive reactions to Dendro made way for what is colloquially termed fridge teams, combining Bloom and Cryo with each other. Ayaka was first and foremost a hyper carry, but with so much of her power budget being attached to an elemental burst attack that persisted even upon switching out, there was potential for her to be used as a quick swapper. That being said, it would be disingenuous of me to say that Dendro and by extension version 3 had no negative effect on Ayaka's standing in the meta. With the game's overall damage floor having been elevated to be stronger and more accessible, vertical investment went from being optional to mandatory on Ayaka. The absence of DPS enhancement on freeze reactions has started to become more noticeable, and as a reminder, she's not the most compatible with reverse melt on a conceptual level. From the perspective of a free-to-play, pragmatic appeal towards Ayaka has diminished considerably, but high-end players were still making good use of her. Provided you had Shunho and other high-quality supports, Ayaka could still maintain a very strong baseline, and with constellations, she would get even better. C3 boosted her already powerful ultimate even further, with C4 providing an extra 30% defense break on enemies. Then with C6, once per 10 seconds, her next charge attack would deal quadruple damage, giving her some of the best front-loaded damage in the game. Up until Fontaine, Ayaka had a stranglehold in speedrunning Spiral Abyss because of this. You would frequently see her topping charts even throughout Sumeru on account of her sheer upfront burst damage at high levels of investment. Granted, C6R5 gameplay is hardly considered by most players in light of the paywall gating the vast majority from ever accessing it, and while C6 Ayaka is another beast entirely, base Ayaka was still notorious for dealing damage so fast you could skip critical boss phases entirely. That was the main way she sustained herself through version 3. She was still one of the best vertical investment hyper carries in the game at that time, though it's not like she had a lot of competition in the first place. Arguably more negatively impactful to her was the growing number of chambers in Spiral Abyss with enemies that could not be frozen. Boss enemies drastically increased in presence, having natural resistance to the reaction, and it's not like all enemies in chambers had to be immune to freeze. It took just one to considerably drop Ayaka's efficiency. For example, you could have a floor with a ton of Hydro enemies, and then for shits and giggles throw in a Frostfall Abyss Herald to disqualify Cryo units entirely, when they would have otherwise been a really good choice in that scenario. For that matter, Cryo was the most efficient choice when dealing with Hydro shields, as not only could you chain freeze some of that need for a Hydro unit yourself, but Cryo also had a type advantage against Hydro, naturally dealing more damage to those types of shields. Following version 3 however, Dendro also dealt effective damage to Hydro shields in addition to getting easier access to Bloom Cores, while not being impeded by Cryo enemies in any way. Though she was a hyper carry, therefore relying more on her own strength than that of her element, much of Ayaka's strength was still tied to freeze, a reaction that, when it did work, is probably the most powerful reaction in the game. Circumstantially, however, freeze became less prevalent and other more consistent reaction-based teams took over. Beyond that, the Cryo element itself received very little attention during late 2022 and early 2023. While we did receive Layla and Mika, neither support contributed much to the Cryo element as a whole. In a similar fashion to how Ito's Mono Geo team is still reliant on frankly outdated or power-crept units, Ayaka was, albeit to a lesser extent, also in the same boat, where she hasn't received any new indirect buffs for quite a while. Furthermore, apart from Shao and Wander, hypercarries took a backseat during version 3's reaction meta. It wasn't until version 4 when they started to see a resurgence, but alas for Ayaka, Fontaine would only make things harder for her. I mentioned before that in the vertical investment department, Ayaka was one of the best, primarily because she had no real competition until Farazan brought Shao and Wander into the equation. Ito and Eula were both having trouble keeping up, while other on-fielders like Ayato, Kutsing, I'll Hate Them, Child, and Hu Tao were more drivers than true hypercarries. Version 4 sought to introduce actual competition in this department. Linny, Navia, Nivelette, and Arlecchino. None of these units are Cryo, mind you, but they are valid targets of vertical investment since most of their respective teams' damage is wholly dependent on them. When it comes to brute strength, these units can match or exceed Ayaka without fail. The only time in which she would beat them is if she had access to freeze, but it's been made very clear at this point that freeze and the Cryo element at large has fallen off in relevance. More boss enemies that naturally resist crowd control effects, even regular enemies like those Hydro Phantasms who can't be frozen, and then you have enemies who like to move around a lot that can't be grouped up easily by anima, which means if you time it incorrectly, you can miss Ayaka's Blizzard and subsequently a huge portion of her damage. With a 20-second cooldown, that can be extremely painful. Ayaka does have persistent uptime through her infinite Cryo infusion and basic attacks, but missing even a few ticks of her burst can drastically fluctuate her damage. Then of course you may recognize these two enemies. Needless to say, they're a massive middle finger to any Cryo team, and I have seen this duo in more version 4 Abyss chambers than I care to count at this point. What made freeze so effective in the spring years of Genshin was how applicable it was. The vast majority of enemies could be grouped up and or frozen, making it an all-purpose solution. Currently though, finding an Abyss floor that doesn't have a boss, an enemy that cannot be frozen, and or a Cryo-resistant enemy is exceedingly rare. Like I said, all it takes is one single enemy to discourage players from wanting to use her. You can have 99 Hydro enemies, but that one Cryo enemy can shut down Ayaka's team almost entirely. That is, unless your Animo and or Hydro unit packs a lot of damage, which is highly unlikely. In short, Ayaka went from being an all-purpose hypercarry DPS with incredible endgame potential to a situational one. From both a casual and hardcore perspective, what originally made her the exception has now become the rule. In her defense, her front-loaded damage is still among the best in the game to this day. But in terms of overall damage output, Fontaine brought in so many more candidates with equal or superior strength, not to mention modern supports that could boost their damage even further. Ayaka could technically also make use of units like Furina to boost her own damage, but a lot of teams want to make use of Furina, and Ayaka is nowhere close to being first on that list. Right now, I'd argue she's still the best Cryo unit in the game even after the addition of Risley, so if and when Cryo gets more modern support, likely in version 5 or something, Ayaka could see a return to form. Honestly, she doesn't even need Cryo support. If they start reinstating chambers that can be chain frozen again, that's really all she needs to go back to being one of the best carries. So is Ayaka washed? Yes and no. Yes in the sense that we have alternatives to speedrunning hypercarry DPS and whatnot, but no in the sense that freeze is still a broken reaction. It's just getting countered a lot as of late. Only time will tell whether she really did fall off or not. Personally, she's now become more of a comfort pick for me. Anytime I see Hydro enemies, my brain immediately just points to her, whether or not they can be frozen. Then again, I have a C2 R2 Ayaka with almost 300% crit damage. Anyone with that much investment would be strong. Just like Ganyu, Ayaka was a core part of Genshin's early years, and I'd like to think she's passing on the torch to the next generation of characters. She carried us through so much of version 2 and version 3 that she's earned a well-deserved retirement. That being said, I wouldn't say she's out of steam quite yet. We've seen tons of old units get retroactively buffed through version 4, so the notion of Ayaka and Cryo as a whole making a return is not too far out of the question. All we can do is hope she gets a chance to make a comeback in the near future. If you guys enjoyed the video, it would be great if you left a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow my Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other What Happened To episodes if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.